imagine a future. Until they understand. And they won't understand it. Theory will take you only. I don't know. But we have no choice.
What made one man create the world's most powerful weapon, and why did he regret it? Discover the shocking true story, hidden facts, and the unforgettable moments behind Oppenheimer 2023. As you're watching SONU HUB, so stay till the end for amazing facts and an honest review. Oppenheimer is a 2023 epic biographical thriller movie written, produced, and directed by Christopher Nolan. The film tells the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the American theoretical physicist who played a huge role in creating the world's first nuclear weapons during World War II. It's based on the 2005 biography American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin. The movie follows Oppenheimer's journey from his early studies to leading the Los Alamos laboratory where the atomic bomb was developed, and later covers the government security hearing he faced in 1954. Cillian Murphy stars as Oppenheimer, while Robert Downey Jr. plays Louis Strauss, a member of the United States Atomic Energy Commission. The movie also features a talented supporting cast that includes Emily Blunt, Matt Damon, Florence Pugh, Josh Hartnett, Casey Affleck, Rami Malek, and Kenneth Branagh. The movie was officially announced in September 2021. It was Christopher Nolan's first movie that wasn't released by Warner Brothers Pictures since Memento in 2000. This happened because Nolan disagreed with Warner Brothers' decision to release movies in theaters and on HBO Max at the same time. Cillian Murphy was the first actor to join the cast, and the rest of the main cast signed on between November 2021 and April 2022. Pre-production got started in January 2022, and filming took place from February through May of the same year. Cinematographer Hoyte van Hoytema shot the movie using a mix of IMAX 65mm and 65mm large format film. It was also the first movie to use IMAX black and white film for certain scenes. Like many of his previous films, Nolan relied heavily on practical effects instead of computer-generated visuals. Even though he said CGI was used very little, the finished movie still included several hundred visual effects shots created by a team of around 160 VFX artists, many of whom did not receive much public recognition. Oppenheimer had its world premiere at Le Grand Rex Theatre in Paris on July 11, 2023. It was released in theaters across the United States and the United Kingdom on July 21 by Universal Pictures. The movie came out on the same day as Barbie, which led to the massive Barbenheimer trend. Fans around the world started watching both movies back to back as a double feature, turning it into a huge pop culture event. Oppenheimer received amazing reviews from critics and audiences, and it earned more than $976 million worldwide at the box office. It became the third highest grossing movie of 2023 and was also the highest grossing biographical movie ever made until it was passed by Michael in 2026. The movie earned a huge number of awards and nominations. At the 96 Academy Awards, Oppenheimer received 13 Oscar nominations and won 7 awards, including Best Picture, Best Director for Christopher Nolan, Best Actor for Cillian Murphy, and Best Supporting Actor for Robert Downey Jr. It also won 5 Golden Globe Awards, including Best Motion Picture Drama, along with 7 British Academy Film Awards, including Best Film. On top of that, both the National Board of Review and the American Film Institute named Oppenheimer one of the top 10 movies of 2023, making it one of the most celebrated and successful films of the year. In 1945, the first atomic bomb is successfully tested, marking a major achievement for J. Robert Oppenheimer, who is leading the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos. Even though Oppenheimer and his team of scientists helped create the bomb, the final decision about how it would be used is taken out of their hands and left to government leaders. President Harry S. Truman decides to use the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Oppenheimer believes Truman should have informed Soviet leader Joseph Stalin before using the bomb in Japan, but Truman chooses not to do that. As tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union grow, Oppenheimer becomes convinced that this decision helped spark the nuclear arms race between the two countries. Although Oppenheimer is celebrated as a national hero after the war, he is deeply troubled by the massive destruction and the huge number of lives lost because of the bomb. Later, he meets with President Truman and admits that he feels personally responsible for what happened. Truman strongly disagrees, telling Oppenheimer that the responsibility belongs to the president because he made the decision to use the bomb. Oppenheimer also argues that the United States should slow down or limit the development of even more powerful nuclear weapons, but Truman dismisses his concerns and continues moving forward. After World War II, Rear Admiral Lewis Strauss, a retired Navy officer and an important member of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission (AEC), asks Oppenheimer to become a scientific advisor for the commission. At first, Oppenheimer accepts the position and continues helping the government with nuclear policy and scientific matters. As an advisor to the AEC, Oppenheimer's opinions quickly become controversial. During the early years of the Cold War, Edward Teller pushes for the development of the hydrogen bomb, which is far more powerful than the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer argues that building a hydrogen bomb would be extremely difficult from a technical standpoint and believes the project should not move forward. Instead, he encourages the AEC to focus on preventing the spread of nuclear weapons and to work toward international agreements that would reduce the risk of another nuclear conflict. Lewis Strauss becomes increasingly frustrated with Oppenheimer for several reasons. He feels embarrassed after Oppenheimer publicly dismisses his concerns about exporting radioactive isotopes, which Strauss believes could help other countries develop atomic weapons. Strauss is also upset because Oppenheimer recommends negotiating with the Soviet Union. After the Soviets successfully test their own atomic bomb, Oppenheimer believes that if the United States builds a hydrogen bomb, the Soviet Union will feel forced to build one too, creating an even more dangerous arms race. He suggests that both countries should agree not to continue developing hydrogen bombs. Despite Oppenheimer's objections, President Truman approves the hydrogen bomb program. Strauss also becomes convinced that Oppenheimer secretly helped the Soviet Union during the Manhattan Project, believing that this is why the Soviets were able to develop their own atomic bomb so quickly after the war. Strauss also believes Oppenheimer personally insulted him during a conversation Oppenheimer had with Albert Einstein in 1947. Even though Strauss does not know what they discussed, he assumes Oppenheimer was speaking negatively about him, which adds to his growing resentment. By 1954, Strauss decides to remove Oppenheimer's political influence. He secretly helps arrange a private security hearing before a personnel security board to review Oppenheimer's Q security clearance. Although the hearing appears to be fair, it quickly becomes obvious that the outcome has already been decided. Strauss publicly claims that the accusations came from William L. Borden, a lawyer and former executive director of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, who wrote a letter to the FBI accusing Oppenheimer of being a security risk. Strauss says Borden was a strong anti-communist who reached his own conclusions after reviewing Oppenheimer's security file. However, the movie strongly suggests that Strauss secretly gave Borden access to those files and used him to help destroy Oppenheimer's reputation. During the hearing, Oppenheimer's past connections to people involved with the Communist Party are used against him. His brother, who worked on the Manhattan Project, was known to have communist ties, and that becomes another reason for suspicion. Testimony from General Leslie Groves and several other colleagues is taken out of context to make Oppenheimer appear untrustworthy. Edward Teller testifies that he no longer has confidence in Oppenheimer and recommends that his security clearance be revoked. In contrast, General Groves speaks in Oppenheimer's defense. The entire hearing takes place behind closed doors as an administrative process instead of a public trial. There is no jury, no public audience, and no requirement for prosecutors to prove their case beyond doubt. Roger Robb serves as special counsel for the AEC during the hearing and is chosen by Strauss. Robb has complete access to Oppenheimer's classified files, while Oppenheimer's own lawyer is denied access to many of the same documents. In the end, the board revokes Oppenheimer's Q clearance, severely damaging his reputation and reducing his influence over American nuclear policy. In 1959, Louis Strauss appears before the US Senate for confirmation as Secretary of Commerce. During the hearing, David Hill testifies and explains that Strauss was motivated by personal revenge when he worked to bring down Oppenheimer. Hill's testimony changes many senators' opinions, and the Senate ultimately votes against Strauss's nomination, preventing him from joining the president's cabinet. In 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson presents Oppenheimer with the Enrico Fermi Award as a way of restoring his public reputation and recognizing his contributions to science. Near the end of the story, a flashback finally reveals what Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein actually talked about during their 1947 conversation. Contrary to what Strauss believed, they never discussed him at all. Instead, Oppenheimer tells Einstein that he fears they have started a chain reaction that cannot be stopped. Not a scientific reaction, but a global nuclear arms race that could eventually lead to the destruction of the world, casting Cillian Murphy's selection as J. Robert Oppenheimer represented the culmination of nearly 2 decades of collaboration with Christopher Nolan. Murphy had previously appeared in supporting capacities across Batman Begins, The Dark Knight Rises, Inception, and Dunkirk. Nolan approached the actor after completing the screenplay adapted from Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin's American Prometheus presenting the opportunity in a characteristically understated manner. Murphy later described the moment as the fulfillment of a private ambition to take a leading role for the director, noting that he had always made himself available regardless of part size, yet harbored a deeper desire for a central character of this magnitude. Nolan emphasized that the script had been written in the first person to place the audience inside Oppenheimer's perspective, thereby placing extraordinary demands on the lead performance. Physical resemblance played a significant role. Nolan cited the intense blue-eyed gaze captured in historical photographs of Oppenheimer as the visual trigger that confirmed Murphy's suitability. The actor underwent extensive preparation, immersing himself in archival materials, recorded speeches, and accounts of Oppenheimer's mannerisms, intellectual intensity, and personal contradictions. Murphy's lean frame and piercing eyes aligned closely with contemporary descriptions of the physicist, allowing the performance to convey both the brilliance that assembled the Manhattan Project team and the later moral torment that followed the Trinity test and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Emily Blunt's casting as Catherine Kitty. Oppenheimer followed a similarly direct process. Nolan invited Blunt to his home in Los Angeles, engaged in conversation for approximately an hour, and then casually offered her the role of Oppenheimer's wife. Blunt has recounted the moment with a mixture of amusement and recognition of Nolan's informal style, noting that the script she subsequently read produced an immediate sense of excitement. Kitty Oppenheimer's historical profile presented a complex challenge. A former Communist Party member, botanist, and mother who struggled with alcoholism and the isolation of Los Alamos, Blunt's prior work in intense dramatic roles, including her collaborations with John Krasinski and her performance in A Quiet Place Part 2 opposite Murphy, positioned her to capture Kitty's sharp intelligence, emotional volatility, and protective ferocity during the security hearing sequences. The casting also created an off-screen connection, as Blunt and Murphy had already established professional rapport, facilitating the portrayal of a marriage marked by both deep loyalty and profound strain. Matt Damon's return to the Nolan fold as Lieutenant General Leslie Groves marked a reunion after Interstellar. Damon has described an unconventional casting sequence in which Nolan visited his New York apartment building, the same building occupied by Emily Blunt, on a Friday evening, delivered the script, and arranged to return the following day at noon after Damon had read it at the film's intended pace. Nolan deliberately staggered the offers to Blunt and Damon to avoid any appearance of convenience casting within a single residential address. Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project, who selected Oppenheimer despite security concerns, required an actor capable of conveying bureaucratic authority, pragmatic ruthlessness, and eventual ambivalence. Damon's established screen presence as both everyman and commanding figure allowed him to embody Grove's dual role as Oppenheimer's champion and institutional overseer. The performance balanced the general's impatience with scientific deliberation against his recognition of Oppenheimer's unique capacity to manage the disparate personalities at Los Alamos. Robert Downey Jr.'s portrayal of Louis Strauss constituted one of the more transformative casting decisions. Downey, long associated with the charismatic Tony Stark persona, accepted a supporting yet pivotal role as the Atomic Energy Commission chairman, whose personal and political antagonism toward Oppenheimer culminated in the 1954 security clearance hearing. Nolan and casting director John Papsidera sought actors whose real-world stature mirrored the historical figure's prominence. Strauss, a powerful figure in post-war nuclear policy, demanded an actor of comparable gravity. Downey's preparation involved stripping away the improvisational energy of his Marvel work in favor of a tightly controlled, often silent intensity. The black and white sequences, centered on Strauss's perspective, benefited from Downey's ability to convey calculation, resentment, and self-justification through subtle shifts in posture and gaze. The performance earned widespread recognition for its restraint and ultimately contributed to Downey's Academy Award win for Best Supporting Actor. Florence Pugh's casting as John Tatlock introduced a younger generation of talent into the ensemble. Tatlock, a psychiatrist and Communist Party member who shared a romantic relationship with Oppenheimer in the 1930s, occupies a critical, emotional, and political position in the narrative. Pugh's capacity for vulnerability and intensity, demonstrated in earlier roles, enabled her to portray Tatlock's intellectual engagement, personal turmoil, and tragic trajectory. The sequences involving Tatlock required careful navigation of historical speculation surrounding her death while remaining grounded in documented interactions. Pugh's presence also reinforced Nolan's preference for actors who could hold the screen opposite Murphy without diminishing the central focus. Josh Hartnett's selection as Ernest Lawrence reflected Nolan's observation that the real on possessed a quality in the scientific community of the era. Lawrence, the Nobel Prize-winning inventor of the cyclotron and a key recruiter for the Manhattan Project, brought both scientific authority and personal charisma. Hartnett's earlier prominence in the late 1990s and early 2000s, followed by a period of selective work, aligned with the need for an actor whose own career trajectory carried a certain mythic resonance. The casting director later noted that the role demanded someone who could project the larger-than-life stature Lawrence held among his peers. Hartnett's performance balanced scientific enthusiasm with the political complexities that later strained his relationship with Oppenheimer. Benny Safdie's casting as Edward Teller introduced an unconventional choice. Safdie, primarily known as a filmmaker and actor in independent cinema, brought an outsider's intensity to the Hungarian-born physicist, often called the father of the hydrogen bomb. Teller's advocacy for thermonuclear weapons and his testimony during Oppenheimer's hearing created one of the film's most charged confrontations. Safdie's physical transformation and focused delivery captured Teller's intellectual fervor and personal distance. The decision to cast a non-traditional leading man in a major supporting scientific role underscored Nolan and Papsidera's commitment to distinctive faces rather than purely star-driven selections. Kenneth Branagh's appearance as Niels Bohr provided both historical weight and theatrical authority. Bohr, the Danish physicist whose complementarity principle and moral counsel influenced Oppenheimer, required an actor capable of conveying quiet gravitas. Branagh's classical training and prior collaborations in high-profile ensembles allowed him to deliver Bohr's pivotal scenes with measured intensity. The casting also reinforced the international dimension of the scientific community depicted in the film. Rami Malek's role as David Hill, the scientist who delivered key testimony against Strauss, offered a concise yet decisive contribution. Malek's ability to command attention in limited screen time proved essential during the Senate hearing sequences. Casey Affleck's portrayal of Colonel Boris Pash, the military intelligence officer who interrogated Oppenheimer about communist associations, introduced a colder, more confrontational energy. Affleck's restrained intensity suited the character's suspicious demeanor and the ethical ambiguity surrounding wartime security measures. The supporting scientific ensemble received equally meticulous attention. David Krumholtz as Isidore Isaac Rabi brought warmth and moral clarity to one of Oppenheimer's closest colleagues. Rabi's historical role as both collaborator and critic demanded an actor who could shift between camaraderie and principled disagreement. Gustav Skarsgård's Hans Bethe, Jack Quaid's Richard Feynman, Danny DeFerrari's Enrico Fermi, Josh Peck's Kenneth Bainbridge, Devon Bostick's Seth Nedermeyer, and Alex Wolff's Luis Alvarez populated the Los Alamos laboratory with recognizable yet individualized presence. Each casting choice prioritized actors who could convey specialized knowledge and distinct personalities within brief appearances. Michael Angarano's Robert Serber, Dylan Arnold's Frank Oppenheimer, and Jefferson Hall's Hakon Chevalier further expanded the personal and political networks surrounding the central figure. Tom Conti's Albert Einstein occupied a symbolic rather than extensive role, yet the casting carried significant weight. Einstein's conversations with Oppenheimer framed larger questions about scientific responsibility. Conti's resemblance and measured delivery provided the necessary gravitas without overshadowing the narrative's focus. Gary Oldman's brief appearance as President Harry S. Truman delivered a sharp counterpoint during the post-war sequences, illustrating the political distance between scientific creators and governmental decision makers. Jason Clarke's Roger Robb served as the aggressive prosecutor during the security hearing, requiring an actor capable of sustained verbal intensity. Tony Goldwyn's Gordon Gray, Matthew Modine's Vannevar Bush, Dane DeHaan's Kenneth Nichols, and Alden Ehrenreich's Senate aide filled institutional roles with precise authority. The larger Senate and hearing ensembles, including performances by Harry Groner, Gregory Jebara, Tim DeKay, and others, created a collective sense of bureaucratic machinery operating against an individual. John Papsidera's approach as casting director emphasized historical fidelity and the real-world stature of the figures portrayed. Nolan and Papsidera discussed the concept of replicating the rock star status that many of these scientists and officials held in the 1940s. The ensemble was designed to feel populated by individuals of genuine significance rather than anonymous supporting players. Auditions for many roles avoided the actual script pages, which remained tightly controlled. Instead, actors performed scenes from other films that tested comparable skills, such as delivering complex technical language under pressure. International casting expanded the pool to find performers whose physical presence and cultural backgrounds aligned with their historical counterparts. Matthias Schweighöfer's Werner Heisenberg exemplified this international dimension, bringing a European sensibility to the German physicist whose wartime activities remained a subject of speculation. Barrandal casting presented its own exacting requirements. Alessi Hartigan casting specialized in period authenticity for extras. Specifications prohibited dyed hair, tattoos, excessive plastic surgery, overplucked eyebrows, and non-period body types. Women arrived with rollers in their hair. Men avoided modern grooming. Open calls in Santa Fe and Los Alamos deliberately sought real scientists and their families, resulting in scenes where a substantial portion of the background performers possessed genuine scientific credentials. Entire families were sometimes cast together to reflect the historical reality of scientists relocating with spouses and children to the isolated New Mexico site. The attention to physical authenticity extended to costume and makeup, ensuring that the visual texture of the 1940s scientific community remained consistent across principal and supporting roles. Nolan's reluctance to employ composite characters further shaped the casting process rather than consolidating historical figures for narrative convenience. The screenplay retained dozens of distinct individuals, each requiring an actor capable of establishing presence quickly. This decision necessitated a large ensemble of recognizable yet differentiated performers. The result was a film in which audiences could track individual contributions to the Manhattan Project and the subsequent political fallout confusion. Actors arrived on set with detailed knowledge of their characters' specific roles in meetings, experiments, and arguments, enabling Nolan to direct from a position of informed collaboration. The casting of female roles beyond Kitty and Tatlock, though more limited by historical constraints, received careful consideration. Olivia Thirlby's Lili Hornig, Emma Dumont's Jackie Oppenheimer, and other supporting women contributed to the depiction of the scientific community's social fabric. The scarcity of prominent female scientific roles reflected the historical demographics of the era rather than oversight, yet the performances that existed were rendered with specificity. Physical and vocal transformation formed another layer of the casting strategy. Murphy's weight loss and adoption of Oppenheimer's distinctive speech patterns and cigarette posture created a continuous visual through line. Downey's shift away from his more familiar screen persona blunts modulation of Kitty's brittle intelligence and vulnerability, and Safdie's embodiment of Teller's restless energy each required substantial preparatory work. The IMAX format and practical effects approach placed additional demands on facial expressiveness and subtle physicality, favoring actors whose performances could withstand extreme magnification. The ensemble's collective chemistry emerged from a combination of established collaborations and deliberate new pairings. Murphy's long history with Nolan provided a foundation of trust. Damon and Blunt's prior acquaintance, though not extensive, facilitated rapid rapport. The inclusion of actors from varied career stages, veterans such as Branagh and Conti, alongside rising talents such as Pugh and Quaid, created a dynamic range of energies. Papsidera later observed that the goal was to fill the frame with individuals who carried their own weight so that no single star appeared isolated amid empty space. Historical accuracy in appearance extended to secondary details. Costume designer Ellen Myronik's research into Oppenheimer's signature fedora involved consultation with multiple hat makers until the correct silhouette was located. Similar care applied to military uniforms, laboratory coats, and period civilian attire across the cast. Makeup and hair departments worked to approximate documented looks without descending into caricature. The black and white sequences representing Strauss's perspective and the security hearing required lighting and performance styles that differed from the color sequences centered on Oppenheimer's experience, further testing the actor's range. The decision to cast against certain expectations produced productive tension. Downey's association with commercial blockbusters made his restrained performance as Strauss particularly striking. Hartnett's return to a high-profile role after years of lower visibility generated audience interest while serving the character's historical charisma. Safdie's dual identity as director and actor brought an analytical sensibility to Teller's ideological commitments. These choices collectively resisted the temptation to create a conventional star vehicle instead constructing a mosaic of performances that mirrored the collaborative yet hierarchical nature of the Manhattan Project itself. Papsidera's collaboration with Nolan on previous films informed the efficiency of the process. The pair had developed a shared language regarding the types of actors who thrived in Nolan's environments, performers comfortable with dense dialogue, practical effects, and limited rehearsal time. The Oppenheimer ensemble largely consisted of actors already known to the director or casting director, reducing the need for extensive open casting for principal roles while still allowing for discoveries in supporting and background positions. International searches and specialized extras casting filled remaining gaps with precision. The security hearing sequence demanded a particular concentration of theatrical skill. Clark's prosecutorial aggression, Downey's defensive calculation, Murphy's controlled disintegration, and the various witnesses' testimonies required actors capable of sustaining high-stakes verbal combat across extended takes. The use of actual transcript material in portions of the dialogue placed additional pressure on precise delivery and emotional authenticity. The ensemble's ability to navigate these sequences without descending into melodrama testified to the care taken in matching performers to the material's historical and dramatic requirements. Secondary military and governmental figures received comparable attention. Dane DeHaan's Kenneth Nichols, the army officer who managed security and logistics, conveyed institutional rigidity. James D'Arcy's Patrick Blackett and other academic figures from Oppenheimer's earlier career established the intellectual milieu that preceded Los Alamos. Each casting decision contributed to a cumulative portrait of the interconnected networks of science, military authority, and political power that defined the atomic age's emergence. The overall casting philosophy rejected both pure star power and pure unknown authenticity in favor of a calibrated mixture. Recognizable faces ensured audience engagement and reflected the historical figure's real-world prominence, while the density of the ensemble prevented any single performance from dominating at the expense of the collective story. The result was a film whose human landscape felt as meticulously constructed as its scientific and political dimensions. Actors of varying degrees of fame occupied the same frame with equal legitimacy, creating a democratic visual field that nonetheless acknowledged hierarchy and influence. Preparation extended beyond individual character study into collective understanding. Many performers researched not only their own roles but the broader scientific and historical context, enabling informed interactions on set. Nolan's preference for practical effects and limited digital intervention placed further emphasis on performance authenticity as actors responded to real environments and practical pyrotechnics rather than green screen approximations. The Trinity test sequence, in particular, required the principal cast to convey awe, terror, and moral reckoning in response to a carefully engineered practical explosion, testing the emotional calibration established through casting and preparation. The inclusion of real scientists among the extras created an unusual feedback loop. Background performers with genuine expertise occasionally offered informal insights that informed the atmosphere of laboratory and meeting scenes. While principal actors retained creative control, the presence of authentic scientific personnel contributed to the texture of the Los Alamos community as depicted on screen. Family castings further reinforced the historical reality of a closed, self-contained society operating under extreme pressure and secrecy. Vocal work received particular attention. Given the film's reliance on dense scientific and legal dialogue, Murphy's modulation of Oppenheimer's distinctive cadence, the varied accents among European emigre scientists, and the clipped military speech of figures such as Groves and Pash all required precise calibration. Dialect and voice coaches worked with the ensemble to ensure consistency without sacrificing intelligibility or emotional truth. The IMAX sound design further amplified the importance of vocal performance, as subtle shifts in tone and volume carried significant dramatic weight. Costume and physicality interacted continuously with casting choices. The transformation of actors into figures whose photographs and film footage remain widely available demanded a balance between resemblance and interpretation. Murphy's adoption of Oppenheimer's characteristic posture and hand gestures, Downey's controlled stillness as Strauss, and Blunt's depiction of Kitty's increasingly brittle physical presence each emerged from the intersection of casting suitability and subsequent preparation. The same principle applied across the supporting ensemble, ensuring that even brief appearances carried visual and behavioral specificity. The casting of younger actors in roles depicting earlier periods of Oppenheimer's life, such as the Cambridge and Berkeley sequences, maintained continuity of presence while allowing for temporal shifts. Dylan Arnold's Frank Oppenheimer and other familial roles grounded the central character's personal history. The careful matching of ages and physical types across timelines reinforced the film's non-linear structure without creating visual discontinuity. Political and ideological dimensions of the historical figures influenced casting sensitivity. Actors portraying individuals with communist associations, security clearance controversies, or advocacy for further weapons development approached their roles with awareness of contemporary resonances while remaining anchored in period specificity. The performances avoided anachronistic judgment, instead presenting the characters' motivations and contradictions as products of their historical moment. The sheer scale of the ensemble, dozens of speaking roles and hundreds of background performers, required logistical sophistication in addition to artistic judgment, scheduling, continuity, and the maintenance of performance energy across a lengthy shoot tested the coherence of the casting plan. Papsidera's experience with large-scale productions and Nolan's established working methods provided the necessary framework. The final assembly of performances demonstrated that the initial conceptual decision to prioritize distinctive historically resonant faces had been executed with consistency. Individual actors brought personal research methodologies that enriched their contributions. Some immersed themselves in scientific literature, others focused on personal correspondence, security files, or contemporary accounts. The diversity of approaches produced a range of interpretive textures within a unified directorial vision. Murphy's deep identification with Oppenheimer's intellectual and moral trajectory set a standard that supporting performers matched in their more limited opportunities. The film's dual structure, color sequences from Oppenheimer's subjective viewpoint and black and white sequences from Strauss's perspective, imposed additional demands on casting and performance. Actors appearing in both visual registers, particularly Murphy and Downey, adjusted their physical and emotional presentation to suit the differing cinematic languages. The casting of performers capable of such modulation proved essential to the narrative's formal ambitions. Background authenticity extended to the depiction of specific historical events and locations, scenes set at Berkeley, Los Alamos, Washington, and the Trinity site required extras whose appearance and behavior aligned with period documentation. The specialized casting company's rigorous standards ensured that modern anachronisms did not intrude upon the visual field. The resulting density of period detail supported the principal performances by creating a fully realized environment. The casting process ultimately reflected Nolan's broader filmmaking philosophy, a preference for practical collaboration, historical specificity, and the elevation of ensemble over individual stardom. By assembling a large group of skilled performers whose combined presence evoked the scale and significance of the Manhattan Project and its aftermath, the production achieved a rare balance between intimate character study and epic historical canvas. Each casting decision, from the lead to the most peripheral speaking role, contributed to a coherent portrait of a generation of scientists, soldiers, and politicians whose collective actions altered the course of human history. The meticulous matching of actor to historical figure, the attention to physical and behavioral authenticity, and the cultivation of a working environment that valued preparation and specificity produced an ensemble whose cumulative effect remains one of the defining achievements of the film. Production, development, and pre-production. The road to Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer began long before Nolan himself was ever attached to the project. Director Sam Mendes had once eyed an adaptation of Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin's 2005 biography, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the sprawling, the Pulitzer Prize-winning account of the physicist's life that would eventually serve as the film's source material. When Mendes's version failed to come together, the book's film rights bounced between various filmmakers for roughly 15 years, with no version ever making it to a soundstage. That long stretch of false starts left the authors skeptical that a movie would ever actually get made. Oliver Stone was among the directors who looked at the material and walked away, later admitting he could not locate the emotional and thematic core he needed to make the story work as a film. A more concrete push toward production came through an unlikely chain of contacts. In 2015, an investor named J. David Wargo acquired an option on the book and spent the following years commissioning and then rejecting a series of scripts, none of which satisfied him enough to move forward. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Wargo traveled to Los Angeles to meet with actor James Woods, an old friend, hoping Woods might have ideas about who could hand the project. Woods arranged an introduction to Charles Rowan, a producer who had worked on several of Nolan's films going back to the Dark Knight trilogy. Rowan in turn passed a copy of American Prometheus along to Nolan. Both Wargo and Woods would eventually receive executive producer credits on the finished film. Woods later revealed that he was asked to stay away from promoting the movie since his outspoken political commentary was seen as a potential liability to the film's commercial prospects and its awards campaign. Nolan's fascination with Oppenheimer predated his exposure to the book by years, even by decades. He has said he had wanted to make a film centered on the physicist long before American Prometheus crossed his desk. The idea crystallized further in 2019 near the end of production on his science fiction thriller Tenet. Star Robert Pattinson gave Nolan a book collecting Oppenheimer speeches, and reading them left an impression on the director. He saw in the writing a man wrestling openly with the moral weight of what he had helped bring into the world. Nolan wanted his film to sit inside that discomfort, to convey what it might have actually felt like to live as Oppenheimer during those years. rather than to observe him from a comfortable historical distance. This was, in his view, a natural but inverted counterpart to Tenet, a film built around the fantasy of using time manipulation to prevent a weapon of mass destruction from ever being unleashed. Oppenheimer, by contrast, would be about a man who could not undo what he had already set in motion. The circumstances around Nolan's choice of studio are inseparable from a very public falling out with Warner Bros., the studio that had backed every one of his films since Insomnia in 2002. In December 2020, in the middle of the pandemic's disruption of theatrical exhibition, Warner Bros. Announced that its entire 2021 slate would premiere simultaneously in theaters and on the HBO Max streaming service.
Nolan, a committed defender of the traditional theatrical experience,
was furious about the decision. He had previously voiced support for a similar simultaneous release strategy used for Wonder Woman 1984, feeling that particular situation had been handled with proper consultation, but he said he had been shut out of any conversation about the postponed theatrical release of his own film Tenet. By early 2021, speculation had begun to circulate that Nolan's next project might be the first in 2 decades not financed or distributed by Warner Bros. That speculation proved accurate. By the middle of 2021, Nolan had parted ways with the studio and was shopping his new Oppenheimer project to other companies. In September 2021, news broke that Nolan would write and direct a biographical film centered on Oppenheimer's role in the Manhattan Project, with Cillian Murphy reportedly in talks to headline it. Given the strain in his relationship with Warner Bros., Nolan approached a range of other studios, including Sony, Universal, Paramount, and Apple's film division. Paramount reportedly fell out of consideration early, in part because of a leadership change at the studio. Incoming CEO Brian Robbins was known as a proponent of prioritizing streaming releases, a philosophy at odds with Nolan's insistence on theatrical exclusivity. Universal ultimately won the project, a decision rooted partly in an existing relationship between Nolan and Donna Langley, the chairwoman and chief content officer of NBC Universal Studio Group. The two had previously tried unsuccessfully to develop a feature adaptation of the British television series The Prisoner. Langley shared Nolan's conviction about the value of a traditional theatrical window, and Universal agreed to both finance and distribute Oppenheimer, targeting a production start in the first quarter of 2022. The studio also agreed to an unusually favorable set of terms for Nolan: a production budget of $100 million, a marketing budget of equal size, an exclusive theatrical window running from 90 to 120 days before any other release platform, 20% of the film's first dollar gross, and a guaranteed 3-week buffer both before and after the film's opening, during which Universal would not release any other new title into theaters. Nolan's personal history with the subject stretched back to childhood. He first became aware of Oppenheimer as a boy after hearing a lyric in the Sting song Russians 1985 that referenced the physicist and the threat of nuclear annihilation. That early brush with the idea of nuclear danger was compounded by growing up during a period marked by anti-nuclear activism in Britain, including the campaign for nuclear disarmament and the protests staged outside RAF Greenham Common. Nolan has described the anxiety produced by that era as something that never fully disappeared, only receding and resurging with world events, and he has said that Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine reawakened a sense of nuclear dread he had carried since childhood. Notably, Nolan had also written years earlier an unproduced script for a biopic of aviator and business mom Howard Hughes, developed around the same time Martin Scorsese was making his own Hughes film, The Aviator 2004. That earlier shelved effort gave Nolan practical experience in structuring a script around a single complicated real-life subject experience he would draw on for Oppenheimer. Actor Emily Blunt later characterized the finished screenplay as surprisingly emotional in register, describing Nolan's approach as smuggling a character study into the shape of a conventional thriller. By September 2021, Rowan and Nolan had begun reaching out directly to Bird and Sherwin to talk through what the adaptation might look like. During his first sit down with Nolan, Bird discovered that the director had already produced a full script on his own, a so-called spec script, even though Nolan chose not to show it to the authors at that early stage. Oppenheimer marked a personal first for Nolan as a screenwriter. It is his first script composed entirely in the first person, built specifically so that the audience would experience events filtered through Oppenheimer's own point of view. Nolan has spoken about wanting to capture the way personal experience intersects with historical and geopolitical forces, framing the project in his mind as something close to a cautionary tale. He began writing only after finishing Tenet and completed a full draft in a matter of months. Even though the idea of an Oppenheimer film had been circling in his head for more than 20 years, by that point, a central concern of the screenplay is the way consequences catch up with a person only after time has passed. Nolan has talked about wanting to dramatize the phenomenon of delayed emotional reckoning, the idea that people rarely experience the full moral weight of their choices in the instant. Those choices are made. Structurally, this is reflected in the film's alternation between color and black and white sequences, a device meant to distinguish subjective experience from a more detached external vantage point. The bulk of material shot in color represents Oppenheimer's own interior perspective, while the black and white sections offer what Nolan has called a more objective view of events as seen through another character's eyes. In pursuit of a deeply subjective visual language, the filmmaking team folded in abstract visions meant to represent Oppenheimer's own mental picture of quantum phenomena, swirling energy, particles, and waves that periodically intrude on the narrative. Nolan has also noted that although the historical Oppenheimer never issued a public apology for his role in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Nolan personally believed the man carried real guilt over what he had done, and he built that belief into Murphy's performance and into the film's emotional arc. Nolan has singled out Oppenheimer as an unusually difficult character to pin down, a figure defined by contradiction almost more than by any single fixed trait, a rare distinction. He has joked, given that his own filmography already includes 3 films about a costumed vigilante whose psychology is famously split. In developing the character, Nolan tried to locate a connective thread running between the abstractions of quantum theory, the physical concept of vibrating energy, and the arc of Oppenheimer's personal life, while also committing to a candid treatment of the more difficult passages of that life, particularly his romantic and sexual entanglements. This included a direct decision to depict his affair with psychiatrist and Communist Party member Jan Tetlock without softening its edges, since Nolan viewed her political affiliation and her influence on Oppenheimer as carrying enormous consequences for the rest of his career and reputation. Nolan was equally drawn to the antagonistic relationship between Oppenheimer and Louis Strauss, the Atomic Energy Commission chairman, whose grudge against the physicist drives much of the film's second half. Nolan has cited the dynamic between Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and his rival Antonio Salieri in the film Amadeus, 1984, as a touchstone for how he wanted that relationship to play out on screen. Another scene Nolan considered pivotal was the meeting in which President Harry Truman dismisses Oppenheimer as a crybaby after the physicist expresses guilt over the bombings. Nolan wanted the moment filtered entirely through Oppenheimer's own disorientation, describing it as a moment of profound disillusionment, a hinge point in which Oppenheimer's understanding of his own place in the world and of how the country actually regarded him is upended. He also wanted to execute a jarring tonal collapse in the aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, moving in the space of only a few minutes of screen time from the euphoric high of apparent triumph down to the darkest possible low. As for the film's conclusion, Nolan deliberately left it open to interpretation, resisting the urge to spell out a tidy message, though he has said he wanted the ending to leave audiences with a persistent, unresolved sense of dread. Casting the film reunited Nolan with Cillian Murphy for a sixth time, though this was the first occasion on which Murphy would carry a Nolan film as its lead, rather than appear in a supporting role. To prepare, Murphy immersed himself in research about Oppenheimer's life and drew inspiration from David Bowie's gaunt, angular look during the 1970s. According to accounts of the casting process, Nolan simply phoned Murphy to offer him the role, and Murphy accepted immediately, thrilled at the prospect of finally leading one of Nolan's films. Nolan subsequently flew to Dublin to meet Murphy in person, and Murphy read the screenplay for the first time inside Nolan's hotel room. In preparing physically for the role, Murphy lost a significant undisclosed amount of weight in order to approximate Oppenheimer's famously gaunt frame. Nolan also arranged a phone conversation between Murphy and Nobel laureate physicist Kip Thorne, who had consulted on Nolan's earlier film Interstellar 2014. As a young graduate student, Thorne had actually attended some of Oppenheimer's own academic seminars, and he shared with Murphy his memories of Oppenheimer's rare talent for guiding a room of scientists through difficult ideas. Secrecy governed the entire casting process to an unusual degree. Some actors reportedly did not learn which historical figure they had been cast to play until after they had already signed contracts. Robert Downey Jr., Matt Damon, and Emily Blunt each accepted substantially reduced salaries to appear in the film, taking roughly $4 million apiece rather than their typical fee, which can run between $10 million and $20 million per picture. Downey traveled to Nolan's home to read the script, printed notably in black text on red paper. He would later call it the finest film he had ever appeared in. The two men actually had an earlier connection. Downey had once auditioned for Nolan to play the villain, Jonathan Crane, also known as Scarecrow in Batman Begins, 2005, a role Nolan ultimately felt did not suit him, giving the part to Murphy instead. Blunt, for her part, met with Nolan in Los Angeles and accepted the role of Catherine Kitty Oppenheimer without hesitation, though she also called Murphy afterward to get a sense of what it would actually be like to work under Nolan's direction. Damon, cast as General Leslie Groves, had previously worked with Nolan on Interstellar. At the time he was offered the part, Damon was on a deliberate break from acting while attending couples therapy with his wife, Luciana Bozan Barroso. But the couple had agreed on one carve-out to that pause. If Nolan ever offered him a role, he would take it. Writer-director Benny Safdie was cast as physicist Edward Teller after Nolan sought out fellow director Paul Thomas Anderson to ask about his experience directing Safdie in Licorice Pizza 2021. Safdie brought a degree of personal familiarity with the world of physics to the role, having worked alongside a nuclear physicist at Columbia University while still in high school. The film also marked something of a departure in Nolan's usual company of collaborators. It is the first Nolan feature since Insomnia 2002 not to feature actor Michael Caine, who had appeared in every one of the director's films in between. Actor Glenn Powell auditioned for the role that eventually went to Josh Hartnett, playing physicist Ernest Lawrence, but was not cast. For the brief but pivotal appearance of President Truman, Nolan turned to his frequent collaborator Gary Oldman, who at the time was on hiatus from filming the Apple TV Plus series Slow Horses. Oldman explained that his contract for that series forbade him from cutting his hair, leaving Nolan with two options: either shoot Oldman as Truman using a bald cap and wig, or recast the part entirely. Nolan chose to work around the hair restriction. Formal pre-production activity was underway in New Mexico by January 2022. A two-day open casting call took place across Santa Fe and Los Alamos, seeking local residents willing to appear as background performers portraying townspeople, military personnel, and scientists of the era. A second casting call followed the next month. Filming principal photography commenced on February 28, 2022 at Ghost Ranch in New Mexico, with Hoyte van Hoytema behind the camera as cinematographer, and the shoot continued for a total of 57 days. That figure represented a significant compression from the original plan. The shooting schedule had initially been designed to run for roughly 85 days. During pre-production, however, it became apparent that completing the film within its $100 million budget, while shooting across so many different locations throughout the United States over that many days, was not realistic. To make the most efficient use of the available money, Nolan opted to blend targeted location shooting in California and New Jersey with the construction of elaborate, historically faithful sets built specifically in New Mexico, and in doing so trimmed the overall schedule down to 57 days. Murphy, who appears in nearly every scene of the finished film, described the resulting pace of the shoot as, in his own word, insane. Gary Oldman's brief appearance as President Truman was scheduled for a single day in May, covering what he described as just a page and a half of material. The production initially planned to film the Oval Office sequence at the Nixon Presidential Library, but that location fell through only a week before the shoot was due to begin. Because Oldman's schedule could not be shifted, the production design team scrambled to redress an existing Oval Office set that had originally been built for the HBO political comedy series Veep 2012-2019. Production designer Ruth De Jong found the set in a state she described as having fallen into significant disrepair before her team restored it. In a more personal touch, Nolan cast his own eldest child, his daughter Flora, in a brief sequence depicting a young woman disintegrating amid a nuclear blast, one of Oppenheimer's recurring visions throughout the film. Nolan has said the moment was meant to convey a simple, chilling idea that anyone who unleashes ultimate destructive power inevitably endangers those closest to them as well. Technically, the production leaned heavily on large format film photography, shooting on a combination of IMAX 65mm and standard 65mm large format stock. The film also broke new ground as the first feature ever to shoot portions of its footage using black and white IMAX film stock. a format that did not previously exist and had to be specially developed by Kodak, with PhotoCam handling the processing work. Van Hoytema shot using 50mm and 80 Hasselblad lenses on IMAX MKIV and IMAX MSM 9802 cameras, while sequences captured on Panavision Panaflex System 65. Studio cameras used Panavision Sphero 65 and System 65 lenses. To capture some of the film's more abstract, science-driven imagery, Panavision built a custom probe lens that allowed the crew to use IMAX cameras for macro and micro photography, employed to record miniature-scale visual effects work. Miniature elements were filmed with IMAX cameras running at 48 frames per second, while any miniature work requiring higher frame rates was instead captured on Super 35mm film using an Arriflex 435 ES camera running at 150 frames per second. Location shooting took the crew to a range of real-world sites. During the second week of April, the production filmed on location at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Additional filming took place in California, centered largely around the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, while scenes meant to represent the city of Berkeley itself were actually shot in nearby Pasadena. New Mexico presented its own logistical puzzle. During a research trip in 2021, Nolan discovered that the real town of Los Alamos had changed too much since the 1940s to double convincingly for its wartime self. Its modern-day equivalent of a main street now features a Starbucks, among other anachronistic additions. Rather than attempt to disguise the contemporary town for exterior shots, the production instead built a full recreation of 1940s era Los Alamos on a similar plateau at Ghost Ranch. Constructing that set took roughly 3 months of work, even though it was ultimately used for only 6 days of actual shooting. The overall strategy called for exterior shots to be captured on the purpose-built Ghost Ranch set, while interior sequences were filmed inside genuine historic buildings still standing in the real town of Los Alamos. Interior filming there began on March 8, 2022. Because many scenes in the film take place inside academic lecture halls, and because reconstructing those spaces as new sets at Ghost Ranch would have been costly and time-consuming, the production instead filmed those sequences inside a historic Women's Army Corps dormitory located in Los Alamos. Additional scenes were shot inside Oppenheimer's actual former cabin in Los Alamos, which had been restored for the production. Kai Bird, one of the co-authors of American Prometheus, visited the set during filming and came away impressed by Murphy's performance. Scenes representing a New York hotel were filmed inside the old post office building in Albuquerque, while sequences representing Washington, D.C. were shot inside government buildings in the actual state capital, Santa Fe. Despite widespread media coverage suggesting that the bulk of the film was shot on location in New Mexico, the official making of book Unleashing Oppenheimer later revealed that a considerable number of the film's most consequential scenes were actually filmed within the studio zone surrounding Los Angeles. Early in the shoot, 3 full days were set aside for filming at UCLA's Kirchhoff Hall, a single location repurposed to stand in for both the film's Cambridge and Göttingen sequences. Southern California locations did a great deal of doubling work throughout the production. The historic Millennium Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles was used to represent several different real-world venues at different points in the story. It stood in for San Francisco's Mark Hopkins Hotel during one of Oppenheimer's encounters with Jean Tatlock, for New York's Plaza Hotel during the sequence depicting Louis Strauss's 1949 birthday celebration, and for an unnamed Washington, D.C. hotel in the scene where physicists Leo Szilard and David Hill attempt to persuade Oppenheimer to sign a petition opposing the use of the bomb against Japan. The pivotal security hearing sequence, meanwhile, was shot inside a disused office building in Alhambra, California, formerly part of the manufacturing headquarters of the petrochemical firm CF. Braun and Co. The specific scene depicting the revocation of Oppenheimer's security clearance was filmed on May 19, 2022, which also happened to be the production's final day of shooting in Alhambra. Perhaps the most talked about aspect of the shoot was the recreation of the Trinity nuclear test, which the production achieved using real practical explosives rather than computer-generated visual effects. When word first spread online that the crew had used actual explosives, some fans, well aware of Nolan's long-standing reputation for favoring in-camera effects over digital ones, briefly speculated, only half-jokingly, that he had somehow detonated an actual nuclear device. Nolan later said he found the rumor both flattering and slightly unsettling, given what it implied about his reputation. The production had sought and obtained government clearance to film at the actual White Sands missile range, site of the historic Trinity test, but the available filming hours proved too restrictive to work with, so the crew instead recreated the test scene elsewhere in the New Mexico desert. Filming took place in and around Belen, New Mexico, where Murphy climbed a 100-foot steel tower built as a faithful replica of the original Trinity test structure, working through difficult weather conditions during the shoot. To generate the explosion itself, the special effects team built a dedicated rig using a combination of gasoline, propane, aluminum powder, and magnesium. Although the sequence relied on miniature models rather than full-scale pyrotechnics, special effects supervisor Scott R. Fisher and his team referred to the models informally as bigatures, since they had pushed to build the miniatures as physically large as they reasonably could, further using forced perspective camera tricks to make the models read on screen as far larger than their true scale. Similar practical in-camera techniques were used to realize the film's more abstract, science-inflected imagery, swirling visions of atoms, molecules, and energy waves, along with depictions of stars, black holes, and supernovas. Nolan has maintained that the finished film contains no computer-generated visual effects at all, describing the goal throughout as capturing what he called genuinely real-world imagery through physical in-camera means. The final stretch of principal photography sent Nolan and Van Hoytema to Europe to gather establishing shots covering the earliest pre-American chapters of Oppenheimer's life. In some cases, the crew opted not to shoot inside the actual historic locations at all. For the film's Cambridge sequences, rather than film on the university grounds itself, Van Hoytema simply positioned a camera on the opposite bank of the river Cam and captured the view from there. Filming officially wrapped in May 2022. Post-production editing on the film was handled by Jennifer Lemey, who had previously cut Tenet for Nolan and returned for this project. During the editing process, Nolan and Lemey conducted what they referred to internally as character passes, dedicated review sessions focused solely on making sure every principal character remained legible and properly represented throughout the film, a concern made more pressing by the unusually fast pace at which the finished cut moves compared to a typical big-budget feature. Visual effects work was handled by the Studio D&AG, marking its 8th collaboration with Nolan across his filmography. Despite Nolan's public insistence on minimal digital intervention, DNAG ultimately produced more than 100 distinct visual effects shots built from more than 400 practically shot elements captured during filming. Andrew Jackson served as the film's visual effects supervisor and characterized the bulk of that work as deliberately invisible effects meant to extend or refine material that had already been created physically on set through in-camera techniques rather than effects generated from nothing. One notable exception involved digital compositing used to build out the multi-layered Trinity test explosion sequence. Since the blast itself had been filmed from several different camera angles and needed to be combined into a single coherent multifaceted view, in total roughly 160 visual effects artists contributed to the finished film, though a large majority of them, 134 individuals, went uncredited when the film was released, a fact that later drew some criticism once it became public. Director Steven Spielberg was reportedly the very first outside viewer to see the completed film, watching a private screening of its first struck 70mm print. Nolan later described the experience of watching a filmmaker of Spielberg's stature absorb the film for the first time as something close to irresistible to observe, even though he had not originally intended to sit in the room while Spielberg watched. Music composer Ludwig Göransson wrote the film's score, continuing a collaboration with Nolan that began on Tenet. A portion of Göransson's music first reached the public in a trailer released on May 8, 2023, and it later featured prominently in a 5-minute preview reel dubbed The Opening Look that Universal Pictures screened exclusively on July 13. Nolan gave Göransson a specific creative directive early on to build Oppenheimer's central musical theme around a solo violin. Göransson has described the appeal of that instrumentation as its emotional elasticity, its capacity to shift almost instantly from warm romantic lyricism into something closer to raw, neurotic horror. Music occupies an unusually dominant place in the finished film's soundscape. By Göransson's own estimate, the score plays continuously for at least 2.5 hours of the film's runtime, accounting for more than 83% of its total length, a proportion far higher than is typical even for a heavily scored Hollywood production. Release theatrical marketing for the film began well over a year before its release. A teaser trailer debuted on July 28, 2022, built around a live countdown timer set to 5:29 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time on July 16, 2023, the 78th anniversary of the original Trinity test, the first detonation of a nuclear weapon in history. The teaser premiered attached to screenings of the horror film Nope before being uploaded to Universal social media channels. The entertainment magazine Empire praised the teaser as characteristic of Nolan's directorial voice, calling it weighty and brooding in tone. 2 additional trailers followed in December 2022, both attached to screenings of Avatar: The Way of Water, one exclusive to IMAX auditoriums, the other shown in standard formats before later being released online as well. A more comprehensive main trailer arrived in May 2023, first shown during preview screenings of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 before its public release online on May 8, alongside a new theatrical poster. Oppenheimer held its world premiere at the historic Le Grand Rex Cinema in Paris on July 11, 2023. A British premiere followed at the Odeon Lux Leicester Square in London on July 13, and an American premiere took place at the AMC Lincoln Square 13 in New York City on July 17. Both the London and New York events were affected by the ongoing 2023 SAG-AFTRA strike. Several cast members left the London premiere early in solidarity with the labor action, and Universal Pictures ultimately cancelled the traditional red carpet portion of the New York premiere altogether. SAG-AFTRA President Fran Drescher later accused the major studios of having misled the union into agreeing to a 12-day extension of ongoing negotiations, allowing studios extra time to continue promoting summer releases such as Oppenheimer before the strike formally began. The film opened theatrically in the United States and the United Kingdom on July 21, 2023, distributed by Universal Pictures. Beyond standard digital cinema presentations, the release included specialty film formats, roughly 30 prints struck in IMAX 70mm, about 113 prints in standard 70mm, and around 80 prints on 35mm. The film's release date placed it directly opposite Barbie, Greta Gerwig's fantasy comedy inspired by Mattel's line of fashion dolls and distributed by Warner Brothers. The very studio Nolan had recently split from. Speculation quickly spread that Warner Brothers had deliberately scheduled Barbie against Oppenheimer as a form of retaliation, intending to siphon away potential ticket sales from Nolan's new film with a rival studio. Whatever the intent behind the scheduling, the tonal collision between a somber 3-hour meditation on nuclear annihilation and a bright comedic film about a plastic doll proved to be commercial gold rather than a competitive disaster. Social media users seized on the incongruity, generating an enormous volume of memes contrasting the two films and eventually encouraging audiences to treat the pairing as a deliberate double feature to be watched back to back on the same day. The resulting cultural phenomenon quickly acquired its own portmanteau nickname, Barbenheimer, and commentators framed the pairing as a rare bright spot of counter-programming amid what was otherwise being described as turmoil across the broader entertainment industry that summer. Cillian Murphy publicly endorsed the trend, encouraging audiences to see both films on the same day, reasoning that if both films were genuinely good, the whole of cinema stood to benefit, regardless of which film individual viewers preferred. The film's international rollout was not without political complications. In March 2022, months before Oppenheimer even began shooting, Universal Pictures had already halted the release of its titles in Russia, joining a broader boycott by major American distributors following Russia's invasion of Ukraine that February. When Oppenheimer was eventually finished, Russia's Ministry of Culture formally declined to license the film for screenings there, stating that it failed to align with the country's stated goal of preserving and reinforcing what it described as traditional Russian spiritual values. Japan represented an even more delicate market given the country's direct historical relationship to the atomic bombings the film depicts from the American side. The film was not released there until 8 months after its initial global rollout. Trade publication Variety noted at the time that Oppenheimer carried an inherently fraught reputation in Japan because of its subject matter, and a Universal spokesperson offered only that release plans for certain markets had not yet been finalized, though American films are often released in Japan somewhat later than their initial international debut as a matter of ordinary distribution practice. In December 2023, the independent Japanese distributor Bitters End announced it would handle a 2024 theatrical release for the film, after Universal's usual Japanese distribution partner, Toho Towa, opted against releasing it. Bitters End ultimately brought Oppenheimer to Japanese theaters on March 29, 2024. where it opened as the highest grossing foreign film in the country during its first 3 days in release, earning roughly 379.3 million yen or about $2.5 million. Content classification varied significantly from territory to territory. In the United States, the Motion Picture Association assigned the film an R rating, citing sexual content, nudity, and language, making it Nolan's first R-rated release since Insomnia in 2002. Australia's classification board issued an MA 15+ rating, citing strong sexual content and a suicide scene. The British Board of Film Classification issued a 15 certificate for strong language and sexual content, restricting admission to viewers 15 and older. In several countries across the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, Universal distributed an altered version of the film in which a nude scene involving Florence Pugh's character was digitally modified to cover her body with a computer-generated black dress. India presented its own distinct censorship process. The film was released there with all depictions of nudity, sexual content, and cigarette smoking edited out, earning a UCA certificate from the Central Board of Film Certification while still retaining its original runtime. Notably, the audio of a widely discussed scene in which John Tatlock directs Oppenheimer to read aloud a verse from the Bhagavad Gita, the line often rendered in English as an expression of having become death. The Destroyer of Worlds was left intact even amid the broader edits. That decision nonetheless generated controversy of its own. India's Minister for Information and Broadcasting, Anurag Thakur, publicly questioned how the scene had been approved by the censor board in the first place given its circumstances and called for the sequence to be cut. A number of Hindu nationalist commentators voiced anger over the scene as well, arguing it was disrespectful. Journalist Uday Maharkar went so far as to publish an open letter to Nolan, describing the scene as an affront to the religious sensibilities of 1 billion Hindus and demanding its removal from every version of the film released anywhere in the world. Other voices pushed back on that reading. Actor Nitish Bharadwaj told the Times of India that the scene needed to be understood in light of Oppenheimer's psychological state as a scientist consumed in every waking moment by thoughts of his own creation, framing the moment depicted in the scene as an incidental, almost mechanical act rather than a deliberate provocation. Home media Oppenheimer arrived on home video on November 21, 2023, released simultaneously across Ultra HD Blu-ray, Standard Blu-ray DVD, and digital formats. Consumer demand proved strong enough that both the Ultra HD and Standard Blu-ray editions sold out within days of release, prompting Universal to work on restocking supply ahead of the holiday shopping season. Nolan was outspoken throughout the home release marketing push about the broader value of physical media, arguing publicly that allowing films to exist only in digital or purely streaming form hands excessive control to corporations and poses a genuine long-term risk to the preservation of film as an art form. The film's streaming debut followed several months later. In the United States, it became available exclusively on Peacock, while Canadian audiences could stream it on Amazon Prime Video, both beginning February 16, 2024. Roughly a year and a half after that, on July 12, 2025, Oppenheimer became available on Netflix in the United Kingdom and Ireland. Reception box office Oppenheimer proved to be a commercial success on a scale that surprised even some industry observers given its unusually serious subject matter, 3-hour runtime, and R rating. The film ultimately grossed $330.1 million across the United States and Canada, combined with $646.7 million from other international territories, for a worldwide total of $976. 8 million of that total, roughly $190 million, came from IMAX screenings alone. Those numbers make it the third highest grossing R-rated film of all time, trailing only Joker 2019 and Deadpool and Wolverine 2024. By September 2023, it had also become the highest grossing biographical film ever released, surpassing the earlier record held by Bohemian Rhapsody 2018. One especially unusual milestone came in August 2023, when Oppenheimer became the highest grossing film in history never to reach the number one position at the domestic North American box office during its opening weekend or afterward, a distinction it held for several weeks. Since Barbie continued to outperform it domestically through most of that stretch, the film did eventually claim the top spot globally during its sixth weekend in release, earning $38, 12 million worldwide that weekend, and surpassing Barbie internationally for the first time. Oppenheimer separately became the highest grossing film centered on World War II, overtaking Nolan's own earlier war film Dunkirk 2017. It also ranked among the 5 highest grossing IMAX releases ever at the time, earning approximately $183 million through IMAX screens alone, around 20% of its overall worldwide gross, with more than $17 million of that specifically attributable to the 30 screens showing true IMAX 70mm prints. Given the strength of those IMAX numbers, the film was brought back for a release in IMAX theaters beginning November 3, including 6 venues capable of showing the IMAX 70mm print, after distributors noted that many IMAX showtimes had been selling out during the initial run trade publication deadline. Hollywood later calculated the film's net profit, once every expense and revenue stream was factored in, at approximately $201.9 million. Domestically, the film's opening was inseparable from the Barbenheimer phenomenon. In the week leading up to release, AMC Theaters reported that more than 40,000 AMC Stubs members had already pre-booked tickets to see both Oppenheimer and Barbie on the same day. Oppenheimer grossed $33 million on its opening day in North America, including $10.5 million from Thursday preview screenings, and went on to post an $82, $5 million opening weekend, finishing in second place behind Barbie, but still marking one of the strongest opening weekends ever recorded for an R-rated drama. The opening weekend audience skewed 64% male, with 33% of viewers falling between the ages of 18 and 34. Industry analysts credited much of that opening strength directly to the Barbenheimer pairing, noting that a combined 79% of all tickets sold that weekend went to one film or the other, representing a combined audience of roughly 18.5 million moviegoers, with Oppenheimer accounting for 27% of that total. The opening also stood as Nolan's best ever debut for an original non-franchise film, ranking behind only the final 2 entries in his Dark Knight trilogy across his entire filmography. Among biographical films specifically, it posted the 3rd highest opening weekend of all time, trailing only The Passion of the Christ 2004 and American Sniper 2014. The film's momentum continued through subsequent weekends, if with the expected pattern of decline. Its second weekend brought in $46.2 million, a 44% drop from opening weekend, though it remained in second place overall behind Barbie. The third weekend saw $28.7 million, dropping the film to third place as it was passed not only by Barbie but by horror sequel Meg 2: The Trench. On August 16, Oppenheimer passed the animated film Sing 2016 to claim the record for highest grossing film in history, never to top the domestic box office chart. Its fourth weekend brought in $18. 8 million, a 35% decline that nonetheless pushed the film back up to second place. Weekends 5 and 6 brought in $10, 7 million and $9 million respectively. Declines of 43 and 16%, with the film settling into third and then fourth place during those stretches, while crossing the $300 million domestic mark by the close of its sixth weekend. Following a leading haul of 13 Academy Award nominations announced later that award season, the film's theater count actually expanded rather than contracted, growing from 1,008 theaters to 262 during its 28th week of release, and posting a $1 million weekend, a 284% jump over the previous week's total, driven by renewed public interest tied to the nominations. Japan's delayed release, arriving on March 29, 2024, carried its own distinct box office story, shaped heavily by the country's historical relationship to the bombings depicted in the film. Ahead of that release, controversy had already flared over perceptions that the earlier Barbenheimer marketing trend trivialized the atomic bombings, prompting Warner Bros. To issue a formal apology over the matter. Despite that controversy, the film performed well commercially once it opened, grossing $5 million and placing third at the Japanese box office. During its opening weekend, public reaction inside Japan was notably mixed and often deeply personal. Some theaters posted content warnings ahead of screenings. A number of viewers from Hiroshima who saw the film reported feeling genuine discomfort and distress while watching it. Much of the debate centered on Nolan's decision not to visually depict the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki themselves, a choice some Japanese viewers praised as appropriately restrained and others criticized as amounting to a form of downplaying or even glorifying the attacks. Takashi Hiroka, a former mayor of Hiroshima, reportedly felt the horror of nuclear weapons had not come through clearly enough in the finished film. Some viewers also felt the film risked glorifying Oppenheimer for his role in creating the bomb, even as others saw him more sympathetically. As someone who was himself a victim of the historical circumstances he found himself caught inside, and who clearly suffered as a result, Masao Tomonaga, who personally survived one of the two bombings, described the film as fundamentally anti-nuclear in its outlook and expressed disappointment that it did not include any scene set in Japan itself, while still saying he found the film's portrayal of Oppenheimer's post-war distress satisfying. Public opinion in Hiroshima was itself divided. At least one resident was reported as actively encouraging others to see the film, while another argued the opposite, urging fewer people to watch it. Reflecting on the film's box office success in Japan months later, in an article for Deadline Hollywood, USC School of Cinematic Arts Vice Dean of Faculty Akira Mizuta Lipit observed that earlier American films dealing with Japan, whether flattering or not, had frequently still found commercial success in Japanese theaters, citing Pearl Harbor and The Last Samurai as films that Japanese audiences had broadly embraced, in contrast with a film like Memoirs of a Geisha, which had connected with Japanese audiences somewhat less successfully outside North America. Oppenheimer opened to $98 million in its first weekend of international release. That figure grew rather than shrank the following weekend, with the film earning $77. $1 million, a 21% decline in that market, but still enough to make Oppenheimer Nolan's highest grossing release ever in 30 separate countries, including India, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey. The third international weekend brought in $52.8 million, a 31% drop, followed by $32 million in the fourth weekend. The film held up relatively well after that, earning $32 million and $29.1 million during its fifth and sixth international weekends, respectively. By September 10, 2023, the film's strongest individual markets outside North America were the United Kingdom at $75 million, China at $61.6 million, Germany at $51.9 million, France at $43.1 million, and Australia at $25.9 million. Critical response: Oppenheimer was met with sweeping critical acclaim upon release, with reviewers repeatedly singling out the screenplay, the performances across its large ensemble cast, and the film's technical craftsmanship as its greatest strengths. Numerous critics ranked it among the very best entries in Nolan's filmography, and many included it among the strongest films of 2023 as a whole. On the review aggregation site Rotten Tomatoes, 93% of 513 collected critic reviews were classified as positive, with an average score of 8.6 out of 10. The site's consensus summary credited the film's success in large part to Murphy's commanding lead performance alongside the film's striking visual craftsmanship. On Metacritic, which calculates a weighted average score rather than a simple percentage, the film earned a score of 90 out of 100 based on 69 critics, a figure the site classifies as indicating universal acclaim. Audience reaction tracked closely with critical opinion. Viewers surveyed by CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of A on a scale running from A+ down to F, while separate audience polling conducted by PostTrack returned a 93% overall positive score, with 74% of respondents saying they would definitely recommend the film to others. Individual reviews were in many cases effusive. Richard Roper of the Chicago Sun-Times awarded the film a perfect 4 out of 4 rating, describing it as one of the finest films made so far in the 21st century. Matthew Jackson of the AV Club called it a genuine masterpiece and argued it represented a meaningful leap forward even within the career of one of the industry's most accomplished filmmakers. Empire's Dan Jolin praised it as a masterfully assembled character study, highlighting both Murphy's performance and Van Hoytema's IMAX cinematography as standout elements. Writing for Reason magazine, Peter Suderman framed the film as functioning almost like a warning about the horror latent in the possibility of full-scale nuclear conflict, arguing that the film captures something essential and unsettling about human nature in the process.